Over the last 2 days, we've been looking a lot at the colonization of North America, Christopher Columbus's discovery, and some of the early colonies constructed by the Spanish. But in case you haven't noticed, Espanol is not the most dominant language in the United States of America, even if it is the language spoken by most of our neighbors to the south. Which tells us that while Spanish colonization might have been successful elsewhere, it was ultimately unable to endure in the territory that makes up the United States today. And if you ever want to know what European country colonized what part of the Western Hemisphere, you usually need look no further than the dominant language that is spoken in that place. And since I'm speaking English, that tells us that the European country that successfully colonized the territory that would eventually become the United States was not Spain, but England. Like most things we study in U.S. history, the English colonization in North America was complex. But before we dive into that complexity, let's start with some simplicity. And the simple part is that the British colonies in North America can be divided into three easy to remember regions. The New England colonies in the Northeast, the Southern colonies in the Southeast, and the Middle colonies in the, wait for it, middle. And the colonies in these regions share more than proximity. They share common characteristic that gives each region a unique identity that helps to differentiate it from the other two regions. Let's start with the Southern colonies. And I start with the Southern colonies because that's where the British started. First with the failed settlement at Roanoke, and later with the more successful settlement at Jamestown, which would become the colony of Virginia. Relations with the native people there started off relatively peacefully, at least relative to what would come later. The Algonquin tribes indigenous to the region were interested in trading with the English colonists to acquire their metal weapons. And the English colonists were obviously interested in trading with the Algonquin tribes to acquire Indian land. But as colonists continued to encroach on native territory, conflict became inevitable. And a combination of inferior weapons technology and an inability to resist European diseases meant that natives could not compete with the English militarily. From the establishment of Jamestown in 1607 to the year 1670, war and disease reduced the Virginian Algonquin population from 24,000 to 2,000. And unfortunately, this story is not unique to the colonial South. But there are other ways that the Southern colonies were unique from other colonial regions. Because of their proximity to the equator, the Southern colonies had a much longer growing season. And a much longer growing season meant that agricultural products would become the driving force of the Southern economy. In 1619, Virginia began to offer free land for anybody willing to pay for their own passage across the Atlantic or the passage of others, which allowed some of the wealthiest colonists in the colony to acquire large plantations. Unfortunately, 1619 is also the year that many historians recognize as the beginning of American slavery, when the first slaves arrived in the colony of Jamestown in order to work those plantations. And as Southern colonization expanded, incorporating new colonies like Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia, the institution of slavery expanded as well, and would become one of the defining characteristics of the American South, both pre- and post-colonization. I should also throw in that 1619 saw the creation of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, which is credited as the first representative government body in colonial America. However, only white male landowners were allowed to vote. Moving on to New England, the story of New England colonization is a story familiar to many Americans. Fleeing religious persecution in England, a group of Puritans or Pilgrims boarded the Mayflower and set sail for North America, ultimately crashing into Plymouth Rock in what would eventually become the colony of Massachusetts. And while the driving force of much of the Puritan colonization of New England was religious liberty, economic opportunities existed as well. Back over in England, the Puritans had been known as the middling sort, a group of modest but successful people who labored as small farmers and shopkeepers and skilled artisans. And this kind of economic activity transferred well to the New England region, where year-round agriculture wasn't really possible, Like the Southern colonists, the New Englanders also received credit for laying the groundwork for foundational ideas in American democracy, theirs being the idea of self-government that was inherent in the Mayflower Compact. But also like the Southern colonists, New England colonists initiated a lot of conflict with the native peoples of the region, even though New England is the location of the first Thanksgiving. New England is also the setting of the Pequot War, a war when New Englanders, along with some native allies, basically wiped out the Pequot tribe. There's also King Philip's War, a war which I find noteworthy because of the alliance formed between a bunch of different native tribes in an attempt to destroy New England settlements. I say it's noteworthy because even though these tribes aren't thinking of themselves as a common native people, they are beginning to identify a common white enemy in the New England settlers. And lastly, I can't talk about New England without mentioning the Salem witch trials. Actually, I can, but I mentioned them anyways because I knew that if I didn't, people would get mad at me, so there. All right, we're filming.
Stop looking at me, Devin.
Be a teacher.
Let's move on to the middle colonies, which are weird and a little tougher to generalize about due to one of their central features, diversity.
You're John the teacher.
Okay.
Go.
But before you go picturing some crazy cornucopia of different colored people living together as one, the kind of diversity I'm referring to is mostly European.
In addition to English settlers, there were also Dutch, Swedes, Finns, French Protestants, Germans, Norwegians, and Scots. And all this diversity in the middle colonies perhaps leads to another characteristic that distinguishes that colonial region from the others, an attitude of tolerance. Because the funny thing about diversity is the more contact you have with it, oftentimes the more tolerant you are of it. Which is why some of the most intolerant people are people from monolithic communities where their only contact with diversity is what they see on TV or the internet. Not that any of the English colonies that we're discussing here had TV or internet. But this attitude of tolerance was certainly embodied by the Quakers who settled Pennsylvania, who had a very accepting attitude to people of diverse origins and belief sets. It's one of the reasons that their early capital city, Philadelphia, meant the city of brotherly love. Middle colonists were also able to cultivate better relationships with native peoples, although better doesn't necessarily always mean great. And I should mention that even though it wasn't to the level of the South, the middle colonies also had slavery, and the New England colonies did too. A reminder that while we can perhaps identify differences in degree, all three colonial regions can rightly be identified as racist, sexist, and hostile towards natives. And lastly, it's worth noting that all the generalizations made here in this video are just that, generalizations, which help us to understand larger themes and characteristics that make one colonial region unique from another, but also don't reflect the true complexity of a colonial region at any given moment in time. Which will be something that you'll want to remember in the coming days as you begin research for your colonial region projects. Maybe you'll even re-watch this video as a potential resource. But even if you don't, thanks at least for watching it all the way through this one time. Adios.